Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Zach Alwitri, and I'm the Associate Director for the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford. For those of you who may be new to the program, or if this is your first event, we are an interdisciplinary research hub at Stanford that supports the study of Islam and Muslim societies. And during the academic year, we host many events that are open to the public. So I encourage you all to either subscribe to our emails or follow us through social media for updates about future events. And so for today's session, just a quick housekeeping note, if you can please submit your questions through the Q&A chat function that should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get through as many of the questions as we can. We'd also love to hear from any students. So if you are a student, just please let us know in the question and we'll make sure to call on you. We also welcome any comments, questions, or feedback that you may have after the session. So please email us. The general email is abbasiprogram@stanford.edu. I also want to thank the Markaz, the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research, Stanford Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and the Muslim Mental Health Lab for supporting this event. And so with that, I'll introduce our speaker. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Rania Awad, who will be sharing some recent findings on the impact of the pandemic on the Muslim community. Dr. Awad is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she is the director of the Muslim Mental Health Lab, associate chair of the Division of Public Mental Health and Population Sciences, and chief of the diversity section in the Department of Psychiatry. Her research and clinical work are focused on the mental health needs of Muslims. Her most recent academic publications include volumes on Islamophobia and psychiatry and the application of Islamic principles to clinical mental health care. At Stanford, Dr. Awad teaches a number of courses from Islamic psychology to the psychology of xenophobia. And through her outreach work, she is also the clinical director of the Bay Area's branch of the Khalil Center, which is a spiritual wellness center pioneering the application of traditional Islamic spiritual healing methods to modern clinical psychology. So with that, please join me in a virtual applause to welcome Dr. Awad.
Thank you so much, Zach. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. So happy to join you today and to join the Abbasi program, which I thank very much for hosting this talk. And also my thanks to the Markaz at Stanford, as well as, of course, the Department of Psychiatry. And of course, our wonderful collaborators at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. And so I'm really excited to share with you some of the great studies. I'm kind of sharing my screen now, but share with you this really neat study that we embarked on right at the beginning of COVID-19. And it's been, and really, I want to take a step back for a moment and really just say here how much I want to acknowledge how much of a difficult time this has been for all people, all across. And the marginalized communities in particular have really carried the brunt of the difficulties related to COVID. And for that reason, with the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab that I run, we were really curious to see how religiosity was looking and religious coping or other forms of coping, and of course the mental health specifically of, in this case, the Muslim community. And I want to say here too, you know, the idea of kind of doing research on a very brand new situation like the pandemic is really of importance, because this is a milestone, of course, in history. But more importantly, what I want to do and share the time with us today together is really to paint the story and the background of the American Muslim community, and to some extent the Muslim communities in the diaspora, right, in the Western world, and where there are some similarities, but also some marked differences, but also here to share how COVID-19 specifically has been affecting us. So with that, I welcome you to this presentation. And the first thing that I like to usually kind of give you as a resource is our lab, actually the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab in this case, and tell you that this is a wonderful resource that you can access online to see what kind of studies and work we're doing. Lots of studies and lots of lines of research. And at the moment, we have about 40 or so wonderful, bright lab research assistants in the lab who are really doing some fantastic work around the topics of Muslims and mental health. Furthermore, I want to introduce everybody, if you don't know yet, the Yaqeen Institute, which is really a wonderful community partner that we're partnered with here, and who were the ones that actually ran the study and were able to collect an incredible number of participants for the study. In fact, I'll share with you more how there were 4 studies, not 4 studies, but 4 questionnaires that actually went out, and the total number of participants across the 4 questionnaires were about 9,000 people globally, 9,000 Muslims globally. So to our knowledge, this is one of the first and also one of the largest studies on COVID-19 and Muslims. So we thank the Yaqeen Institute for their assistance and for really, particularly Dr. Osman Amarji, who is the head of the Islamic psycho-spiritual department at Yaqeen, for really thinking about putting this study together. Now, I'm going to take a step back here and do some background and discussion. I understand that most people that are attending this lecture are either familiar with the Muslim population or curiously familiar with them as well. And I do think that it's important to kind of pause a moment and kind of see, what do we know exactly? And before I say anything, I want to say there is no way that what I can say today will capture the understandings, the opinions, the beliefs, the ideas, the practices of nearly 2 billion people in the world. There's no way that I can do that justice. Furthermore, it's really difficult for me to even be able to do justice to just the 6 to 10 million Muslims that are here in the United States. And so what's really important and what I want to point out here is that nearly 1/3 of Muslims in the world globally live as minorities in non-Muslim majority countries. And what that means is that their experience of Islam is going to be naturally different than those who live in Muslim majority countries. So I'm not today speaking at all about Muslim majority countries, Muslims from Muslim majority countries. Even though our data captured that, we actually isolated the data for this presentation to be for those who are from Western countries and diaspora, and focusing specifically on the US. Furthermore, I wanted to also say that we decided to really focus on telling the story of the American Muslims in the last 4 years, specifically 4 to 5 years. We're really conscious of the fact that election season is upon us, and presidential elections are just days away now. And what that means for the American Muslim community. So I'm going to take a step back before we jump into COVID and 2020, is really taking a step back and looking at the last few years leading up to this point in time. So with that, we talk about, well, who are the Muslims and where did they come from exactly? There are multiple waves of migration for Muslims. The earliest, of course, came along with the African slaves who came from Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. And anywhere between 15 to 30% of those slaves were in fact Muslim from their home countries. Muslims arrived along with Columbus and were here before him. And at the same time, we had larger numbers of immigration that happened in the late 1800s and even larger in the late 1900s until the present day. In terms of the demographics of the US Muslims, this is of particular interest and different than most, even in the diaspora, quite different and really important to say, because if we were together in a room, I often would ask and say, do we know what are the demographics? Who are the folks that make up the American Muslim community? And often we'd get back Arabs, and often would also get back South Asians, Indian, Pakistani, right, Muslims, and some other combination of ethnicities. But rarely do people realize and actually list out African Americans as being not only one of the largest groups, but a substantial group, even with numbers as big as, or sometimes in some studies larger than, even the Arab, Middle Eastern, or South Asian communities. And there is also an interesting number here, which is of particular importance, of the white Caucasian convert community. And a number that's not here is the Latinx community or the Native American community, who are converts to Islam as well. And although they're a much smaller population, are important population to take into consideration of what we talk about intersectional identities, of multiple identities, really coming to surface and interacting with one another, as we now discuss and kind of add a layer of COVID to the story. And the rest of the population, as you see here, is broad, the breadth of Muslims across the world. There are Muslims from every country and every background. And for that reason, like I said at the beginning, I cannot actually capture, nor will this study ever capture all of the different opinions considering the diversity. But at the very least, we'll try to capture some of that understanding today. Now, this I put up because we're going to start from the story from 2016, roughly the last election cycle, about exactly 4 years, almost to this day, and what that looked like for Muslims, particularly as the president took office, and the very first, of course, ruling, as you know, that went into effect, an executive order, in fact, was the travel ban, since dubbed the Muslim ban, for many reasons, one of which, of course, is that the majority of the countries that were affected by this ban were Muslim majority countries. We are in third or fourth iteration now of the ban, but it's still very much in effect. And for American Muslims, although the story, as we said, starts further back, we're really focusing on these last few years and what they've looked like. And so for many, it's been a very difficult time, with some silver linings, such as the signs of that people are holding up here saying this is not in our name. But for many American Muslims, this has been a really particularly difficult several years. And other silver linings, for example, I put up here one of my sheroes, if you will. This, for many, I hope you know who this is, that this is Ibtihaj Muhammad. She is an Olympian and the first American Olympian, to represent the US wearing hijab in the Olympics. She's a fencer and a bronze medalist for the US, and has a Barbie doll now made in her liking. and what's interesting, what's interesting about this is that, when this came out a few years back, the Muslim community, so many of us were like, wow, this is amazing. Having grown up playing with Barbies myself, seeing a Barbie with hijab on was really kind of almost like, is this kind of surreal? And not just any person, but someone who's really worth, celebrating their accomplishments and what they've done for the US. And what's interesting here, and the story goes, and I like to share the story of how when I first saw this image, this exact image, I was scrolling through my feed, and I saw this and I kind of stopped and went, whoa. And I called my daughter over and said, look at this. And she too was kind of like really kind of surprised by this picture and even said, Mom, is this real? And I said, yes, it's real. Take a look. It's Ibtihaj, and we have a picture here with our selfie together sometime later, and it was just such a wonderful kind of beautiful moment in time, especially as an American Muslim. But as I'm scrolling through my feed and looking at the comments that are being made right under the picture, the announcement from Mattel, who owns Barbie, and my daughter's still peering over my shoulder, the next image I see is this, right? And in the comment section, people are writing and posting pictures such as this, saying, if Mattel is going to be making hijab wearing Barbies, then this is how they should actually make them look, right? This kind of misconstrued look of the oppressed Muslim woman who is, abused and oppressed and so on and so forth. And this was terrible because right in that moment, I moved the screen really far away from my daughter to where, of course, being, the nosy 10-year-old said, why are you taking the screen? What's going on? And in that moment, it's like, do I show her this image and just, and kind of prick the bubble of her childhood, right? And have that conversation right then and there about what's happening in the larger larger society as Muslims, all around us, or do I keep her in her childhood for a little bit longer? And I think this is kind of a sentiment that so many of us have really been, so many Muslims in America, and by extension, again, in the diaspora, have really been witnessing and feeling. And honestly, it doesn't necessarily get better because you go into the next year of 2019, and we spent quite a bit of time in the lab researching and looking at, we have a whole line on the topic of suicide in the Muslim community, which is of course a difficult topic, and in many cases a stigmatized and taboo topic. And we were tracking a particular series of suicides that happened, Muslims, that were all in one county here in California. And they were all either refugees or asylum seekers. And we thought, what on earth is going on? We were trying to track this. And I ended up publishing a paper with some colleagues in the Lancet about this. And it all kind of went back to another rule of this current, I guess still current, yes, administration on, the public charge rule, which is not a new rule, but definitely one that was put up and really emphasized during this administration and expanded. And that rule, for those of you who don't know what the public charge rule is, it basically states, and this is where mental health becomes important, it basically states that if an immigrant uses public resources, such as food stamps or public health or mental health services, then they are considered to be a public charge and therefore become inadmissible, potentially inadmissible for citizenship. And so here were people who were, were refugees and asylum seeker who turn out don't actually apply, even this rule doesn't even apply to them, but they were so, because of either language barriers or access difficulties or just difficulties in general, were seeking out care for their trauma, coming as refugees from war-torn places that had quite a bit of trauma, accessing public services, including public mental health services. And as the case study that I used, here, a young man who used county public mental health and ended up taking his life because he thought, because I've accessed the system, I'm now public charge, therefore I can never become an American citizen and I will be extradited back to my home country, which I never want to go back to because that's where the trauma originated from, and so on and so forth. So for many, these years have been very difficult. These last years have been very, very difficult on so many segments and members of the Muslim community. And, that kind of leads us to the topic of why is this happening? And the very important discussion on Islamophobia and xenophobia, the broader discussion of the fear of others who are different than yourself, and the topic of xenophobia, which is, this anti-Islamic sentiment and rhetoric, and quite a bit of historic and widespread fear and prejudice or distrust of Muslims. And regardless, by the way, of their age or their education or even their partisan affiliation. And this is something that's very much happening. The levels of Islamophobia are quite high. And you see here that we, I have the book here that we worked on publishing as the first kind of evidence-based work that actually tracks the effect of Islamophobia on the mental health of the Muslim community. And, it's quite high. If you look here at some of the numbers, here is a public health health center in Chicago, and you see here that the numbers of folks that are coming in are really, really high. The mental health impact of Islamophobia, the direct correlation of really high levels of adjustment disorder, but also high rates of paranoia and depressive symptoms. And paranoia is very interesting, actually, because, anecdotally in the Muslim community, there had always been this level of paranoia of we're being surveilled, there's surveillance around us. And then, people would say, no, that's not. But then the study on the NYPD and the surveillance of Muslims comes out and it's like, oh, this was real. Or they're going to collect all our names and put us on a registry. And then, and people in the community, no, shush, that's not really the case. And then Trump comes out and says, Muslim registry, right? So, I mean, and when the travel ban happened, there was definitely the sense of like, what we're saying isn't just paranoia, some of this is actually real. And there comes then the whole discussion of like the layers of difficulty, right? Where there is actual increased discrimination, hate crimes, there is actual government surveillance in some cases, but there's also, and there are actual real laws limiting access, like the travel bans and such. And then there's the media representation, or you can say misrepresentation of Muslims that is almost constant up until this point. And only now do we start seeing kind of like the hijabi Barbie or other ads that you now see hijab and Muslim looking people or Muslim sounding names in entertainment and media that really wasn't prevalent, especially as I was growing up, and many others as well. That Islamophobia is still winning in many cases, because it's not just the travel ban. You have many years prior to that, the Patriot Act, and you have so many studies that have now come out saying you can directly link Islamophobia to hate crimes, even bullying of school children. And as a parent, the studies that come out and say 50%, 1 in every 2 Muslim kids that go to school is going to experience hate crimes, right? Because of their faith background, because of their name, the way they look, how they dress, and so on and so forth, that they're going to experience discrimination or bullying based on simply their Muslim identity. And that's alarming. And so for many, again, these layers that we're talking about is something that has been, leading up before we even touch COVID, kind of painting the picture of where the community has been, especially in the last 4 to 5 years. So you see whether it's individual level, community level, policy level, you kind of see it all throughout that there's really quite a bit of difficulty that this community has been facing. And so now the question becomes, well, how do you cope? How has the community been doing? And again, I'm talking broad strokes here, not individuals, but broad strokes. And really saying here, in broad strokes, the type of coping that we have found in literature, when we did literature reviews of how's Muslim community been coping, a lot of it was actually religious coping. And as a faith community, that might make sense, except that for some, there's a whole spectrum of practice, right? Of people who identify as being Muslim, but a whole spectrum of how they practice the faith. And so here we discuss the concept of intrinsic religiosity versus extrinsic religiosity. Intrinsic meaning a person's individual, right, connection or relationship with the divine, their own prayers, their own supplications, their own kind of dependence on God, versus extrinsic religiosity, which is much more in communal aspects, right? The Ramadan fast is which is a communal kind of fasting together, praying the Friday prayers in congregation together. The Hajj pilgrimage, of course, is millions of people praying side by side together. And so what does that do for a faith community like the Muslim community? Similar to other faith communities, here we're focusing on the Muslim community. It fosters a sense of belonging and unity and collective kind of responsibility. It holds a lot of, spiritual merit and reward. The community becomes a really important aspect of an American Muslim faith, and for Muslims in the diaspora, where the mosque is no longer a place of worship only. It is the community center. It is the heart of the community. It is where you take your kids even for their kickboxing lessons potentially, right? And where they have their classes and their schooling and various things happening there, and charitable work and social justice work. All of this is happening potentially out of the community center. And so it holds a much, much higher place, if you will. The community, or the extrinsic religiosity, extrinsic coping, is really important when you talk about, again, a community in the diaspora and very much a marginalized community here. And what does it do for those who are attending that community setting, right? Often you find that there is a correlation in literature with lower rates of depression, better social functioning, more emotional support that's given and received from the community. So with that being said, now we enter into COVID-19 and the year of 2020. And this, when everything I'm going to present here, I'm realizing that we are nowhere near done, right? We are still smack in the middle of all of this. And I think that's what becomes kind of really interesting and important in this discussion of how do we conceptualize what happens to the Muslim community? So that's what the study was about. And first, we're going to take a step back and talk about COVID-19 in the US in general. So numbers that many of you are, of course, familiar with, that you have over 200,000 lives lost. You have 2 times higher the death rate in marginalized communities like African American as opposed to white American communities. There's an economic burden that by April already, at that point, already 20 million jobs have been lost and more since. You find that the people that are most affected by COVID are those who are women, non-white workers and low wage earners, right? And those who are less educated. And I put here in bold that the mental health burden is what is most elevated and across the board, right? Regardless of education, regardless of, income, regardless of really anything across the board, you see the mental health effects of COVID much higher than the physical effects of COVID, to where you have over half the American population reporting negative mental health effects due to the pandemic, and 13%, and we'll come back to this number later, 13% saying that they have increased substance use in order to cope. Now, religion and COVID is an interesting kind of study too. There's a really interesting study that came out earlier this year by the Pew Research Center that tracked American religiosity, because there was a turning to faith in a way that people in this time of uncertainty kind of turned to faith and turned to something bigger than themselves at numbers much higher than we had ever seen, actually. And that's what the Pew Research study showed and kind of showed it across different religious groups. And globally, there was definitely this sense of using religiosity to cope for some populations. And I thought this study right here was very interesting. In March of 2020, the Google searches that happened for prayer, that the people Googling prayers, reached record high numbers, surpassing even other events, that were happening in that time, like Ramadan and Easter. But this, and then there were multiple studies that happened on specific faith communities. So there's a similar study to ours on the American Orthodox Jewish community and COVID-19, finding that their intrinsic religiosity and trust also was increased and correlated with decreased stress and positive mental health outcomes. So we thought all of this was very interesting and worth looking at the Muslim community. So here starts the conversation on Muslims and COVID, and how there are actually multiple hadith prophetic traditions that speak about the plague. And, this concept of the plague are very similar to what we call the pandemic, right? Where and very, very interesting right here, the quote that we have here on behalf of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that says, "Do not enter a land in which there is a plague, nor exit a land fleeing from the plague." And that many scholars took as that is the Islamic ruling on what happens when a plague breaks out. And there's so many discussions and a lot of interpretation as to what exactly this meant. And in many ways, it's like, do not put yourself at harm by entering a place where a plague is. But if you're there, do not put other people in harm's way by leaving, lest you be affected and then carry it elsewhere. And that became a religious injunction. And there are others. This is just one of kind of discussions of plague, because the plague is, this concept of, a pandemic in history is not something new, but new, right, in our current, for anybody who's currently alive, new for those of us who are currently here. And this concept of uncertainty and tolerance. This is a word I'm going to use quite a bit in the rest of this discussion because it comes up a lot in our study. And this idea of being able to tolerate uncertainty, we have found is actually something that often comes with religious coping. Because if it's so uncertain, what are you going to hold on to? And that's where kind of religion for faith communities comes into effect. Now, here's something really interesting as well, where we asked folks, and we'll see the numbers just shortly, about whether they felt that COVID-19 was a test or a punishment from God. And the results were really interesting. We kind of had hypothesized what exactly would come through here, but we're actually pretty surprised at the results. And the fact that because the answer would be unknown to humanity, this is kind of the Muslim belief that only God holds certainty, then the goal here is to really get closer to God, regardless of whether it is a test or a punishment, is the Muslim kind of belief. So now we discuss kind of like what happened exactly during COVID-19. And here are some of the pictures you see here, people with their prayer rugs, which otherwise would be shoulder to shoulder and side by side, but they're spaced 6 feet apart, right? And you see here the Hajj pilgrimage on the bottom, the Hajj pilgrimage on the bottom here, which otherwise would have 2.5 million people, really densely packed in, which could not happen in COVID. And here they are spaced out and limited to only 1,000 people. So from 2.5 million to 1,000, the Hajj itself looked incredibly different. And for a long time, the Haram, or the mosque in which the Kaaba here is held, one of the most holiest site of Islam, was closed down and shut down. And for many Muslims, that was really kind of difficult and even terrifying to see that, to see this holy space kind of shut down. And so there was quite a bit of adaptation, everything from the prayers to praying outside, to spacing the prayers, to praying at home, and the Ramadan, if you remember, the month of fasting came in the midst of COVID, right? And people had to figure out, well, I normally break fast communally, right? With the community, with others around me. People normally do not break fast alone. And so how do I adapt this and what do I do, right? And then there's special congregational prayers that are prayed called the Tarawih, specifically in Ramadan, that also would be limited. So what do you do? Then came the Eid celebrations, both of the major Muslim holidays, the Eid, both happened in quarantine. And there was a lot of discussion of like, well, we can't pray communally, congregationally, and we can't visit family and friends. So what do we do exactly? And there was a lot of discussions of having home celebrations and drive-through Eid celebrations, right? So there was a lot of adaptation in COVID during this quarantine that really made quite different and very unique in history. So here's some of the research questions that we asked, and I'll show you how we broke down these studies. As I mentioned, it was multiple different studies that were questionnaires that were sent out, and they were sent out in different parts of the pandemic. One was sent out at the very beginning, first week literally of the pandemic. Then pre-Ramadan and post-Ramadan is how we split the others. And the kind of questions that we asked is, in the beginning, how do Muslims feel? Do they feel isolated? Do they, what are their beliefs about this pandemic? What do they think is happening here? And what are the behaviors that correlate with it? And for the second stage, during pre-Ramadan, there was a lot of trepidation, like how am I going to have this very new and different Ramadan experience? And post-Ramadan to figure out, well, what happened? So, and as you see here, the dates are really interesting. I mean, the initial quarantine, and this is where I thank Dr. Amarji, it was right on. It was like the first week of quarantine, right? The first questionnaire went out and captured a good number of people. And as you see here, the next several studies or questionnaires that went out, capturing somewhere around 4,000, folks. And if you see here who we chose to isolate for this study, there's a larger number of people, but we chose to isolate folks from North America, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and any of the lands that are considered to be in the Muslim diaspora. And we found that generally speaking, most of the people who answered our sample were actually quite educated, and females, right, 73% were women in the sample. Now, in terms of the measures that we used, we tried to use scales and questions that were already already used in literature before, so we can do a comparison, although there were some new questions that were constructed as well. And we did kind of a basic descriptive statistics for frequency, means, and medians, of which we're going to share with you some of that now. So here we go. You take a look here at the stage 1 of the initial quarantine. And for me, of this particular slide, what I find most interesting are the questions of what do you believe about COVID-19? And interestingly, we found that the majority of Muslims actually believed that either it was a test from God or a wake-up call from God. And very few numbers felt that it was a punishment from God or a punishment to China, which was interesting because that's kind of where the initial, from Wuhan, that's where the initial was surfacing that this is where COVID had initiated from at the time. And so, that wasn't necessarily where Muslims were looking to as a test, but rather that this was much more, a test, rather a punishment, but much more as a test from God. And therefore, some of the ways in which they their behaviors kind of corresponded to that we find that those who believe that it was a test were more likely to engage in reading the Quran, for example. And those who felt that it was, a substantial punishment and test were more likely to engage in religious coping. Now, for the mental health of the population, compared to the numbers I showed you earlier about kind of the broader American community, the numbers here are different, actually, and to us, surprising. We actually did not expect this, that the mental health of the sample reported, who took the study, reported that it was only about 11% of them who had experienced poor mental health. And at the very beginning of the quarantine, roughly half said that they really experienced no mental health difficulties just yet. And for those who did not actually, for those who experienced the mental health difficulties, they were more likely to be folks who had a lot of uncertainty, intolerance. They were having difficulty grappling or tolerating uncertainty. And as a result, they had a difficult time seeing blessings or silver linings in this pandemic, giving gratitude or being able to pray 5 times a day or read the Quran. And for others, in terms of other ways of kind of coping, for those who engaged in kind of this religious coping mechanisms that we talked about, they were more likely to be able to show that gratitude and to pray 5 times a day and to read the Quran if they were able to see blessings or a silver lining in this pandemic that we're experiencing. So as such, actually, the majority of the population between somewhat better and much better actually had or described having a better relationship with God. Also not fully expected result here. In stage 2 of the pandemic, this is now pre-Ramadan. This is the group of people who took the survey getting ready for the month of Ramadan, and kind of what we hypothesized to be a lot of anxiety, because this is anecdotally what we were seeing all around us, a lot of anxiety and difficulty of how will I have a Ramadan isolated and in quarantine when this is meant to be a very communal month. And so we used the PHQ-9, which is for depression, checking depression, and found that the sample, about 12%, met cutoff for major depressive disorder, lower than we actually had expected. And we used the GAD-7 to test for generalized anxiety, and found that about 9% actually met the cutoff for generalized anxiety as well, whereas 28% felt that there was really no mental health concerns that they were dealing with. And for those that were experiencing these mental health difficulties, again, they were often correlated with having higher levels of uncertainty intolerance and not being able to engage in mindfulness and having lower levels of self-esteem in general. That's what predicted these depressive kind of symptoms. And for me, most interesting on this part of the study is right here on the bottom point, which basically is that if a person had, even one standard deviation increase in uncertainty, intolerance, even just one more standard deviation over, they were 60% more likely to have major depressive disorder. So if we take a step back for a moment, we're going to get to our discussion in a moment here, but taking just a step back right here, this is so interesting to me that there is, that in this faith community, holding on, and by extension, we'll show that it's not just the Muslim community, but even larger populations, holding on to the topic of certainty versus uncertainty and being able to tolerate uncertainty actually protected against developing major depressive disorder. Now, what kinds of coping were they using? We kind of categorize them in three types of coping. We have general, what we call general coping, which is essentially, walking outdoors or cleaning more. We saw so many people who, because they were home and probably home much more than they'd ever been before, cleaning out closets, organizing things, right? That we call that general coping. And there was a good number of people, a third of the population who took the study, who did so. Now for negative coping here, this is an important number. And I'm going to kind of give a, kind of take a step back here and say, of course, this is a population that is self-reporting, and who took the study, they are self-selecting, right? Nevertheless, despite that, and of course the numbers might be much more biased here than that in reality, but it is still interesting to note that what was reported in terms of using drugs and alcohol to cope was only 1% of the population, compared to the larger American sample that we saw as 13%. And 6% reporting watching illicit materials such as pornography to cope. Now, for those who had kind of more positively, that had this, those who had poor mental health were also likely to have difficulty with uncertainty, right? Tolerating uncertainty. And interestingly, also difficulties with financial concerns, right? And so those seem to be the correlates to having this, using negative coping mechanisms and having poor mental health in general. And if you looked at the religious coping, this we see kind of used pretty broadly in the sample of Muslims. That with Muslims in the population that we studied here, that they were more likely, and by here I mean 3 in 4 people were more likely to make dua or supplication prayers, and 2 in 3 people, or about 66%, were likely to read the Quran in order to help cope. So that's, the majority of the population, right, are engaging in religious coping to help alleviate the difficulties that they were experiencing from the pandemic. And in terms of their relationship with God, with Allah, here you find that actually the numbers are higher. And honestly, we did not really expect this kind of turn. It does match now with the Pew Research Center and other studies of other faith communities have experiencing. It wasn't something we hypothesized in the very beginning here, but we found that actually people reported feeling that their connection or relationship with God was somewhat better or much better. And that was the majority, if you put those two together. And that when you had that positive relationship with God, there was a correlation with religious coping, being able to see the silver linings, right? And being able to tolerate, right, the uncertainty. Now, for the point about financial concerns, I think that's one that we really need to focus on here, because we found that regardless of religiosity, regardless of using kind of religious coping, if there was financial concern in place, there was definitely a high correlation with the inability to tolerate uncertainty, right? And inability to engage in like mindfulness or really being able to soothe oneself through the difficulties of the pandemic. And the last stage, and the third stage of the research that we put out was post Ramadan. And here too, we were not sure how people's Ramadan had went. It was really unclear, and we wanted to study and see, well, how did this very unique Ramadan in history kind of show itself? So amazingly, we found that 73%, right? So such a high number of the population reported that this was a better Ramadan than they had ever experienced, including compared to the prior year. And we thought that was really kind of really, really interesting to see, right? And there was still the 10% or so that said it was a worse Ramadan. They did not appreciate this type of Ramadan, but it really made us try to sort out, well, what was it actually that made Ramadan so good for so many people, despite us thinking that it wouldn't necessarily be that way. So a couple more points here, and then we'll kind of discuss and break down what we think the results of the findings were. But some of the correlations for having a good Ramadan ended up being that people were accessing the content of their masjid or mosque or community center that they would otherwise have gone in person, accessing that content online, virtually. Turned out to be something that was actually very useful for people. And there was a lot of self-reporting, self-regulation that was happening, reading the Quran more, praying what otherwise would have been congregational prayers, praying them at home, alone, or in small groups, like with the family, giving charity, engaging in mindfulness. All these things seem to have allowed people to have a good Ramadan in social isolation. And we thought that was particularly interesting as well, including the discussions on philanthropy, because so many of the Muslim community centers, organizations, nonprofits, they depend on philanthropy. They depend on donations and charity. And there was a concern that if there weren't physical events to go to, right, and benefit dinners and fundraising dinners and so on and so forth that typically might happen around this time of year, that these organizations would not be able to float. But it turned out that the numbers were actually kind of in thirds, where about a third said they actually donated the same as before, a third less, and a third more, which was very interesting and worth kind of thinking about how that ended up happening. So here we get to the point of our discussion, and I hope to open up after discussion for questions and kind of discuss with you a little bit more. But interestingly, in terms of the discussion, one of the things that we know for sure from the study is that COVID-19 definitely did affect how Muslims practice and access their faith, because in the literature that we reviewed, we saw very much that if you look at the role of the community center, the mosque or masjid or community center, for many, not all, but for many Muslims, that this was really central to their life and central to the ways they were engaging with their faith or religion or community members. And several studies that actually showed that having that engagement with that community actually helped them either in lowering or recovering from mental illness and lowering rates of depression and improved social functioning. And we were concerned, taking that away, what that would do for the mental health of the community. Also, we found that Muslims, that had a greater mosque attendance, of course, pre-COVID, were more likely to give and receive kind of that community support. And there was quite a bit of literature that talked about not just the Muslim community, but other faith communities, but definitely the Muslim community, that had in it a lot of protective factors against distress and mental health, especially at times of crisis like this. And taking that away during a pandemic, there was really concern about what this would do to the mental health of the community. So and then there's also the point about the discussion here related to Ramadan and how Muslims were experiencing Ramadan, and how this kind of communal breaking of fast and communal prayers, it was actually in many cases a difficult and different Ramadan, but not necessarily a worse Ramadan. In fact, many, as we said, 73% said it was a better Ramadan, and they were able to adapt events by holding them virtually and accessing them virtually. And for many, they would also say having the time to be alone at home in isolation actually allowed and took away a lot of the distractions that came from communal gatherings, and really focused in on the relationship between them and God, right? And their kind of personal connection. Now, despite the challenges, we found that the religiosity levels, interestingly enough, were improved, as we mentioned before, and that the mental health of the community was improved. And, post Ramadan. And what's interesting here is if you compare the numbers to the general American population, it looks like the faith holding on to faith or kind of increasing in faith since the pandemic went up by about 24%, right? 24% of the overall American population felt that their faith had strengthened because of the pandemic. And the closest number to the Muslims was actually the African-American church, Black churches, in which the numbers actually are much higher than 24%. Their numbers are closer to about 56%, right, of folks that attended Black churches felt that their faith had strengthened because of the pandemic. But if you look even that closely, right, even though the Black churches were close, the Muslim community was even higher. Close to 70% of Muslims felt that they reported having an improved relationship with God. And here, and I didn't say this earlier, and I think it's worth saying right now, that in case you're wondering, well, maybe the sample was a highly religious sample or highly skewed, towards those who are religious. Interestingly enough, running the rest of the demographics on the studies that the population that we collected the data from, they're very much what we would call the Muslim middle. As in to say that the middle, as in to say they were not highly religious. And for many of them, they were not highly engaged in 5 daily prayers and fasting of Ramadan and other kind of ritualistic parts of the faith, as you might think. And so interestingly enough, this is the population answering, particularly the third of the surveys, the one that was post-Ramadan. And many of them said, they really didn't engage too closely with Ramadan prior to this year. So something about the isolation, something about like taking the distractions away, something about focusing, internally, intrinsically kind of focusing on the personal relationship with God and the faith seems to account for some of the numbers here to the best of our knowledge. So here we'll kind of end and wrap up this discussion with trying to kind of explain a little bit here about Islamic theological beliefs and the coping behavior, some of the theories that we had. One is that the Islamic belief system is very much what we call a holistic belief system. It's meant to be a way of life, is a way many people describe Islam. There's rules and regulations and rituals surrounding everything from dress to the way what they eat and don't eat and how they engage in life and their marriage and their, and their raising their children and, how they engage in worship. I mean, it's kind of like a holistic way of life when you think of it that way. And so for many, it's then the theory here was that that Muslims then would turn towards religion whenever there was something that was very difficult and lots of uncertainty related to it, and they would turn to religion to cope. And while that sounds maybe at the surface great, the reality is it's a two-edged sword, if you will. It's the kind of thing where, yes, it definitely helped many people cope, as far as we can tell in this study, but at the same time, it also meant that there was a lot of turning to, Islamic and religious coping instead of professional help when needed. And that is problematic and something that's still very prevalent within the Muslim community, and part of why we do the work we do at the Muslim Mental Health Lab of breaking that stigma of getting the professional help and support when needed. And so we find then, like we mentioned these numbers before, that the vast majority, 3 in 4 Muslims would make dua and 2 in 3 would recite Quran, as opposed to getting any other support or help. And that's an important point here. Also, the number of prophetic hadith or Quranic verses that address kind of the nature of life as being that this is a test, this whole entire worldly life, if you will, and there's an afterlife, and this world now is a life in which it's meant to have trials and tribulations. And for many Muslims, they took this as, well, here is a trial and tribulation. And we found that that was the majority of how Muslims responded to the question, as opposed to a punishment. And so therefore, seeing that pandemic from the eyes of religion actually meant that more Muslims were going to engage in religious coping and being able to see the silver lining of the pandemic through the eyes of religion. And our study validated this theory as well. And here, that last kind of point here that I'll make about this concept of uncertainty intolerance or uncertainty tolerance, being able to tolerate uncertainty, is really key and something you find as a core belief in the Islamic system, where only certainty lies with God. And therefore, and this is what's really interesting here, regardless of religiosity, of how religious a person is, or whether they're affiliated religiously with any religious community or not, the interesting part here is that there is a higher likelihood of suffering from major depressive disorder if a person has high levels of uncertainty, intolerance, right? Not being able to tolerate uncertainty. And so for people from the faith community, and here the Muslim community in specific that we're talking about today, they were using faith or religion to cope with that uncertainty, essentially. And we will need further research to be able to explore this more and to really see how this affects all the different aspects and lived experiences of Muslim life. So with that, and with the way I like to, before we take our questions, like I like to end is usually to give you some resources, especially since I spoke a lot about mental health here. The book on Islamophobia and psychiatry I spoke about before and is available and now published by Springer and available there. Just recently, earlier this year, we published another book on applying Islamic principles to clinical mental health care. Very excited about this book. It just came out in July by Routledge and available there. The study that I talked about today is really what's going to be published in this middle book here that's forthcoming sometime next year by Brill. There'll be this book called Islam, Muslims, and COVID-19, which you'll find our chapter as part of that book. And this book over here, the textbook on Muslim mental health, I'm very excited about because in about another year or so, this will be a clinical handbook for clinicians who hope and work with Muslim communities, which I'm taking the lead kind of in editing this book and very excited about it coming through. And since I did talk about the topic of suicide, I think it's important to mention that we are working on a very important kind of prevention, postvention, intervention work adapted for the Muslim community that should be coming out fairly soon as well. So kind of sharing some of those resources. And also to share, since we're here in the Bay Area, California, I need to share, of course, that one of the best and most important places to refer people in case there are clinicians or even folks who are watching saying, okay, well, maybe we need some more help in working with the Muslim community. Where do we send folks? Well, a great place to send them is the Khalil Center, which is a clinic, a holistic kind of community wellness center and a clinic in which focuses on specifically, has a niche expertise in Muslim mental health specifically. It is actually the largest provider of Muslim mental health care in North America, with offices, 3 of them here in San Francisco Bay Area, started in Chicago, and also has offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Toronto, and now even Istanbul. And so I give here some of the information that you may capture and also kind of keep with you so that in case as you're listening to this or want to come across and have folks that need more help mental health wise, this would be a great place to refer them. And here's my information and kind of contact in order to stay in touch. And with that, I'd love to take some of your questions.
Thank you, Rania, for that wonderful presentation. So we're taking questions through the Q&A. Rania, would you like me to read out some of the questions or do you want to read them yourself?
I actually can't seem to access it unless I, a little smaller. So yes, please, Zach, if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll moderate the questions. So Merva asks if you could talk a little bit about the age range of the sample and whether you found any developmental differences.
Yes, there's definitely some. We actually decided to look at an adult population. This was not a child. This is not, our cutoff was the age of 18 and upwards. And we did, in fact, some of the slides I believe actually shows here that there was a developmental difference in some of the studies with more, especially that concept of uncertainty, tolerance being higher in the older population versus the younger population. So we did actually see an age differential there. Yeah.
Okay, and then the next question, Anas says that he's curious about how uncertainty tolerance was measured in your study, and is also wondering if you have any information if the well-being of Muslims is correlated with the number of people the person is living with, so the immediate family.
That's a great question, actually. I do not believe that the survey actually asked that specifically, like how many people were in your household, and which is actually a great question. And which is like, if you were super isolated versus having some people, even if it's very small numbers of people, but you had other people other than your plants, I suppose, or pets to talk to, if that, made a difference, right? And so again, this was our attempts, and thank you for bringing that forward, because I think we'll definitely try to incorporate that in future studies.
Great. Anonymous asks if you've seen any increases in perceived Islamophobia during COVID-19.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I should probably give a pitch here that one of my colleagues who works on the topic of Islamophobia, Dr. Hatem Bazian, literally just launched the study on perceived Islamophobia that he's running in these next couple of weeks. And I think he's specifically trying to capture not only COVID, but we know historically that the levels of Islamophobia and faith-based hate crimes in general rise with every election cycle. And this is Islamophobia, this is anti-Semitism, this is all the different types of faith-based hate crimes. So yes, I mean, we are hypothesizing that that is the case. And I hope that people will engage in that study in order to really make sure and see if our hypothesis is accurate or not. But it has been historically, yes.
Asma asks about technology, the use of laptops and phones and the internet during the COVID-19 lockdown. Do we have any data about how this technology has affected how we cope with, or if it's changed, if it had any implication for religiosity?
That sounds like the next wonderful questions of a study. It wasn't on this particular study, but it's of utmost importance because, as you all know, we're all becoming sort of Zoom experts here, right? And the similar resources. The one thing that I can say that our study did capture was definitely that we saw the same kind of programming that people might have attended during Ramadan was able to, I would say, fairly seamlessly transfer over into the virtual space and did correspond with better coping and better mental health and better religiosity in general. So with that, there is a correlation there from this study, but I think that's worth the next study for sure.
Oh, great. And Lara asks, well, she says that the idea of positive isolation is something that we're learning about in this crisis. And she's curious whether the initial period of the lockdown gave people an opportunity to engage in more spiritual sort of reflection.
So the very first part of the question, Zach, was?
Just the idea that there's a positive aspect to isolation.
Yes. And that's, interestingly, Laura, that I think that's what we're seeing here too. And in many cases not quite expected, to be honest with you, but it does seem that there was particularly around the Ramadan and that period of like a lot of spiritual kind of turning inward and introspection, the isolation actually seemed to help and follows a lot of the Islamic spiritual mechanisms of very similar to meditation of, meditative contemplative states, which requires kind of being isolated from all those and all the noise, if you will, around you. So we did actually see that to be the case. I do not know if I can say the same in the long term, like as this carries on and we don't know where this will end and when it'll end, if that will continue to be the case. But it certainly was in that period of time, yes.
Great. And a couple of people asked, how was religiosity measured in your test?
Yes. Great question. We actually wanted to look at behavioral mechanisms as much as possible, more so, and we, so we tried to measure and ask questions related to, and by behavioral I mean things like reading Quran, praying prayers, engaging in charity, engaging in fasting, kind of the major rituals of the faith, and to see whether behaviorally there was kind of that connection. Because we did make a distinction between religiosity as in like turning towards actual behavioral parts of the faith, ritual parts of the faith, as opposed to spiritual parts, as in to say, one's connections without kind of the tying to it, the actual ritualistic aspects. The one thing I will say here, which I thought was really interesting, is like I said, the Muslim middle, which took this study, if you will, and many of whom, especially in the third study, said they had never really engaged strongly with ritualistic parts of the faith, were still folks who read Quran and turned to prayer and supplication or dua during this pandemic, in that time of uncertainty and need. And I thought that was particularly interesting.
Nimra asks if you have any breakdown of the socioeconomic and racial demographics for the population of the study.
We do, and I don't have it here, but it is actually something that we report on in our larger chapter. And so I hope you'll be able to take a look at that and kind of see that it was actually, I would say, a pretty vast breakdown and a very, very big number, especially when you look globally. And so it's quite large, and we decided not to capture it here in this particular talk because of the many varieties in it, but will be captured within our paper that's coming out on the topic.
Great. And I think these two questions might be related. Hamza asks if there was perhaps a limit to religious coping as a mechanism for dealing with mental stress and mental health, and at what point is professional help needed in individual cases. And Ihsan asks, was religious coping as effective for those who initially had poorer mental health compared to those who, maybe average?
Mhm. And I really welcome the question, especially because I feel so strongly about this topic of mental health and not pushing aside or minimizing at all one's religiosity, spirituality, connection to God, but really the importance of getting mental health. I mean, I feel like this is my life's work and calling, if you will. But I made this point, but maybe subtly in the talk of saying, while and it makes sense of why it is that Muslims chose religious coping by and large deal with the pandemic, the reality is that two-edged sword of it meant that there was also not as much reaching out to professional care, right, and mental health, actual mental health professionals and care when needed. It was much more going to the religious aspects, whether individually or to the religious community, like the imams and so on, for coping and leaning on, and that to me is problematic in that when a person, as the question kind of insinuates here, that when a person is in need of actual professional mental health support, do we allow it and keep saying, well, it's a good thing that they're turning to religious coping? And the answer for me, as somebody who, as you know, was trained in both as a psychiatrist and in Islamic sciences, both, right? I say that no, actually, the faith, if anything, the faith itself, take culture out, would say you seek out the people of knowledge. And in this case, the people of knowledge are not the spiritual and religious teachers, but rather they are the mental health professionals when we're talking about a mental health condition.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is of utmost importance, and we see it here. It's kind of what we figured and happened in the community. It's the topic and push towards getting mental health is still kind of pushing against a big boulder, right? We're still kind of really kind of breaking, trying to break down that stigma, not just in the Muslim community, many communities, but there is a trend and it is growing and it is moving in the right direction, I hope.
Great, thank you. Anonymous asks about the rising stress that's been generally observed in Generation Z. Do you have any suggestions or advice for Muslim college students in particular who are facing academic pressures on top of everything else you talked about?
Yes, absolutely. And I have to say, and the Stanford students on here know because I spend so much time with them, that the reality is, yes, your stress is real and your stress is multi-layered and complex. And in terms of suggestions, this is where kind of speaking to the earlier point of reaching out for help and not being ashamed too, realizing and being, showing ourselves grace, right? Of being able to say, this is a difficult time and not faulting yourself and saying, why can't I get through this, right? But rather saying, this is a difficult time. I'm not meant to perfect this and I cannot and will not without actual more help and support. And what does that support look like? And then we open up the discussion on, do we need to be talking about professional care, coaching care? And I know a lot of that is actually made available here at Stanford and hopefully outside of it. But really taking that first step of seeking out care. For many, they're going to seek out their friends and family first, and that's perfectly fine. But we would hope that friends and family and religious leaders and others that people kind of lean on, professors, teachers, et cetera, coaches, mentors, that they know when the limit is to be able to refer to actual help and care, professional help and care when needed. So thank you for that question. You have all my encouragement to kind of show yourself that grace and also seek out the support when needed, please.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another anonymous question asks, what lessons should we be learning about for the transition back to hopefully soon a more communal practice and a more communal life as we come out of the pandemic? So what should we be keeping in mind as we transition back?
That's a great question. And, it's one I thought about quite a bit. And I'll say this and I'll kind of pause to say that, a lot of the work that I do in the Muslim community is actually with women. And I run an entire nonprofit on, educating Muslim women and girls and in the Islamic sciences and so on. And I've often thought about this because there's so many different parts of contentions, if you will, about pre-COVID, about, that community and communal space and what does that look like for people who are marginalized, and for people who are, and for women, and for girls, and so on and so forth. And I thought so much about when we get back, when we finally all get back, there's, that whole concept of distance makes the heart grow fonder. And so for many, there's like, oh, wow, we're back into the community space that we couldn't be in, the mosques, the settings, just gathering together. But I also want to say that I hope that this was really a moment of reflection I saw in Ramadan, for example, some of the things that the organization that I'm with, the Rahma Foundation, we have these programs, and you'll see what the point I'm making here, with these programs for women, and usually women, either because there was difficulty in accessing the mosque, which is a whole other subject for another day, another time, but important, or because simply they were at stages of their life where they had, I don't know, young children or elderly parents or different people they were taking care of, and they could not be part of that communal setting and often felt left out in Ramadan. But somehow when we were all in isolation and quarantine and everything was through the virtual space, we were doing these virtual programs, sometimes the night prayers, the Tarawih prayers, and the all-night prayers that are in the special nights of Ramadan just as women, and we'd have thousands, literally thousands of women show up. And in some cases they were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 women show up. And we'd say, where on earth did all these women come from? And part of and that's not something you see in the mosque. And so part of that was, when we get back to that communal space, figuring out who was left out of the story and why were they left out, and how do we incorporate people back in? Because like we said in the research here, having that communal space means more social integration and more better mental health and better everything, right? So who's left out of the picture? And it's not just women, it's also a lot of the marginalized groups as well. And so long story short, I really do hope that this is something that many choose to focus their energies on and make sure that there's better integration as we move forward back into these spaces.
Great. I have a question from, I think, Tarawat, who asks, do you see some kind of contradiction or tension between Islamic psychology and Islamic psychiatry and Western medicine approach to psychology and mental health?
So this person knew exactly my passion.
Yes.
On this topic, and the source, and I'm sorry I didn't catch the name, but I'll definitely refer you to the many lectures and talks that we've given. In fact, we have a whole 6-part series running right now every Thursday morning on the topic of Islamic psychology and how it relates to Western psychology, if you will. And do I feel that there are contentions? There are some, but are they something that we can't move forward? No. And is there something really called Islamic psychology? Absolutely. And not only is there, but it's a very strong revival of what used to be a very strong system of ilm al-nafs, or the study of the self and soul, in which Islamic psychology is derived from. An incredible history related to mental health. Please check out our history line in the research lab on all the studies and chapters and books and such that we've published on how the Muslim civilization was really the first, to our knowledge, to come through with psychiatric wards and psychiatric hospitals and whole treatment methods of working with the mentally ill. And I think that's incredible, and it's not accidental. So that's, again, another discussion for another day.
Great, thanks. So Ingrid asks, she makes an interesting distinction between situational uncertainty intolerance and uncertainty intolerance that is part of one's character, perhaps. Have you been able to tease out a difference along those lines? She says that if a person does not have the privilege of having savings and basic needs met, we might expect them that they would want more certainty. So that might be the situational case.
Absolutely. And I think here, this is where the study would be lovely to kind of go into, to parse it out even deeper and figure out exactly the correlations. We did not ask this level of detail about, whether, all we could really do here is kind of correlate as much as possible these items together. And so, but I think you're absolutely right, that if a person is experiencing kind of their own personal kind of situational uncertainty, like finances, that it would be something that might actually kind of go above the broader issues of uncertainty that everybody else is experiencing as well. And we do definitely, the issue of finances showed up again and again and again as we were crunching the data. And so there's definitely something to be said about that form of uncertainty.
Great, thank you. Okay, Noor asks if we know about Muslims' homelessness in America. Um, were you able to capture anything along the impact of COVID-19 on whether people are housed during this time?
Not
Sorry,
in the
that was
study.
not very clear.
It's okay. It's an important question, but we didn't capture that in this particular study.
Okay. Lara asks if the study or the report is available to read, and this is something that we could perhaps share with the attendees by email.
Yeah, it would be wonderful. In fact, I'm happy to share that we've submitted this chapter to that book that I was referencing earlier. In fact, I can probably try to pull that back up here. You know, the one that's going to be, oops, hang on, by Brill, this right here. And so this is just a mock-up of the cover, but it'll be, the chapter will actually be in this book. And we have a couple of other papers related to the data sets, this large data set on other topics related to this data we've collected that will show up in other papers with the Yaqeen Institute and also in some of the academic publications like this book and other journals. So whenever we have those published, we're happy to send your way, Zach, to share.
Great. So Lou asks if we have data on the prevalence of COVID in the Muslim population, and you know, we know that there is a difference between different minority groups in the U.S. and elsewhere. Do you have any information about Muslims as a group?
Globally, I don't have numbers specifically because they're very much kind of parsed out by geographic location or countries. And as exactly as you mentioned, different countries have higher rates or lower rates depending on what's happening in those countries. And so what we tried to capture was really kind of we focused really more on the Western, you know, demographic, if you will, of Muslims. And that's where we kind of focused the study.
Great. So I'm just checking the time. We have about 3 more minutes and a few more questions. Let's see. There's an anonymous question about whether you have plans to extend some of these questions and correlations as a longitudinal component for tracking the same individuals, and if you will explore how mental health may have changed at the individual level over time.
Yeah, I love the idea of a longitudinal study. I have to say that what we did here was this was an anonymous study. So we did not actually track or try to backtrack the same people again. So it won't work for a longitudinal study with the same exact people. But what we do plan on doing, and as far as we're interested from our partners at Yaqeen, is that there is a plan to continue to actually put out studies over the course of this COVID pandemic to see how the numbers and also different questions. And one of the, there's actually a 4th study that has already gone out, and it was right at the time in the summer of all the social injustice when it looked like the peak of all of that happened, that captured some really interesting data about, just social justice and injustice and how Muslims were Muslims in relations to that. So some of those papers are coming out as well. So you will see more work, not longitudinal in the sense of following these exact people, but just like over time, we'll capture more data. Yaqeen does plan on doing a really interesting longitudinal Muslim study that is more like a holistic Muslim study of families and children that Dr. Osman Amarji will be leading and can probably share with you more. That's very exciting in my opinion. And so it might actually be one of the first longitudinal Muslim American studies.
Great. So I have an anonymous question that asks if you have any recommendations to Stanford University leadership, the president and the provost, concerning care for Muslim faculty, staff, and students around the upcoming elections and ongoing COVID crisis. You know, I know that Stanford has resources around the election. I think it's election.stanford.edu is a website that provides some of those resources, but do you have any message to our employer about the Muslim community specifically?
Definitely. I mean, to definitely, like I mentioned earlier, that this is a time where we kind of are, and we all should be kind of on high alert because of the unfortunate and the story that I kind of painted at the very beginning of how the last several years have looked, you know, and what the uncertainty, speaking of uncertainty of what's happening right around the corner, we really don't know. And there's just a lot of angst in the community, both at Stanford and broader than that. And as we know, there are many Stanford students, for example, that are still affected by the travel ban, who are still here, unable to be reunited with their families or go back home, or if they went back home, they could not come back, and so on and so forth from our international students. So these are issues that affect, the Stanford community greatly. And I have to say that there are some corners of the Stanford community that have been really excellent. And here I want to give a shout out to ORSL, the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, that is actually currently in the search of a Muslim chaplain and associate dean for Muslim life, which I think is excellent. I've been sort of filling in that position for this last year and working with the students, both in their mental health and also in kind of the Muslim student union in general and other Muslim students on campus. So I really look forward to that position being filled. And I think putting all the efforts into that search is going to be really key to continue helping the Muslim students on campus. And also a shout out to, again, like the Abbasi program for doing programs like this, and also the Markaz. It's been a really wonderful place for Muslims, regardless of their level of religiosity, practice, or so on, but just their identity as a Muslim and all of its programming as well. They also have a wealth of mental health resources, there we go, at the Markaz as well. So these are great places that I want to acknowledge, and also just reminding our leadership of, whether it's the Muslim community or other marginalized communities, this is the time of really kind of being keen to check in and make sure that all is well.
Great. And I think this will be our last question. Anonymous asks about the study. If you saw any specific insights or interesting correlations around children and adolescents.
So unfortunately, the study was focused on adults and not on children. Although the other study that I mentioned too, that is yet to happen, which we hope to happen, which is the Muslim Life Study, the longitudinal study that plans to take children and actually, over the course of time, their adolescence and into their adulthood and so on, kind of follow them over time, is something that's very exciting and upcoming. So I hope that's useful. And in general, anecdotally, from what I know in the Muslim community and the work of the Khalil Center and the other work that we do, yes, the children and adolescents are 100% affected by this. And maybe in some cases even more, because unlike adult versions of coping, right, their mechanisms are much more immature in that sense. And so, there's my heart goes out to them and to all the parents and caretakers of the children and adolescents that are going through these difficult times. Folks, please do reach out for help when you need the help and your loved ones and family members need help. That's kind of the most important message I can give today.
Great. Well, Rania, thank you so much for this excellent presentation and talk and all the resources that you've shared. I'm happy to pass along anything that through an email follow up to the participants today, and we can share some of those resources with them. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all the questions we had today. So if you would like your question answered, please email us abbasiprogram@stanford.edu, and we'll get it to Rania and hopefully get a response back to you. And so with that, again, please join me in thanking Dr. Awad for speaking to us today, and have a good evening, and we'll see you at the next event.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you so much, everybody. Take care. Have a good day.